My earliest memory, I think, is of waking on my daddy's shoulder. We were returning from prayer meeting across the pasture. It had been muggy and hot in the church, and I dropped off to sleep. My parents didn't have a car or truck and had to walk to church and to the store down by the highway unless some neighbor gave them a ride. It was a moonless night. And as I woke, rocked by the rhythms of Daddy's steps, the stars overhead danced so close they seemed to whisper, and the glistening dew on the grass appeared to answer the starlight. Mama and my sister Evangeline walked beside us, each carrying a small flashlight. What I remember best about the moment of waking is the strength and warmth of Daddy's shoulder, the motion of each step, and the washing of the stars as we moved, suspended between those worlds, as though far out between glittering galaxies. But so close to Daddy I could hear his heartbeat. Somewhere among the trees on the hill there was an extraordinary fanfare of katydids, for it was that time in late summer. It was dog days, when copperheads supposedly crawled blind in the grass and would strike at anything within reach. So Mama and Evangeline looked intently at the spots lit by their flashlights. Besides snakes, they looked for cow piles to dodge also. And I must have dropped back to sleep, still swaying among the stars, for I don't remember reaching the house above the river and being put to bed. Another memory, perhaps just as early, I can't be sure, is of the tractor that plowed the bottom land between the house and the river in early spring. It was a red International tractor, and to me it was a revelation and a wonder. The machine belonged to Babe Ward, who lived farther up the river valley. Perhaps I'd never seen a tractor so close up before. I heard it go puff, puff, puff as it came down the road to the pasture, and I heard the growl of its motor as it started again after the gate was closed. I watched the tractor as it passed the row of Irish junipers along the driveway and stopped beside the corn crib. Daddy hurried out to talk to the driver, and I stood beside the trellis gate smelling the scent of exhaust as the red beast trembled with power, even as it idled. Two shiny plows were raised behind it, twisted like leaping fish. Our little turning plow pulled with a horse had no such weight and size. When Daddy finished talking to him, Babe pulled a lever beside the steering wheel, and the engine roared and blasted smoke from the pipe above the motor. As it rolled down the bank to the field, the machine clanked with weight and precise control, bouncing on the ruts. I ran outside the fence to watch Babe as he steered around the early transparent apple tree at the upper edge of the field and lowered the plows into the stubble. The curved blade sliced into the soil and flung it over, covering the old corn stalks and dead briars. The fresh dirt glistened, glazed with moisture and worms and bits of quartz and mica. For much of the morning, I stood on the bank watching the tractor circle and return. A giant tapestry of new soil was being made, 2 threads at a time, with a rainbow of different shades of dirt, from bright to dull red, brown and tan, gray and black, uncovered beneath the dead weeds and stubble. The field looked like a rough fabric of earth colors, but strangely the furrows, as they circled, resembled a giant thumbprint also. For all my all, and wonder about machines, especially motor vehicles, there was a taint to them also. A kind of thread, a dread, even a poison. It was not just because of their loudness and heat, the sense of power and danger, the shiver of the strange, the unhuman. It was a feeling passed on to me by Mama I never completely explained. It had to do with the fact that we didn't have a car or truck of our own. Those wonderful machines belonged to other people. Cars made Mama feel weak and vulnerable because she had to ask other people for a ride to town, to the store, to the doctor, to work in the cotton mill. I knew she was ashamed to ask, and yet she had no choice. It's something of a mystery to me, looking back, why Daddy seemed to have no interest in owning a car or truck. I'd heard stories of the Model T Ford he had owned in the 1920s when he was in his 20s. Daddy had driven the Model T north to Ohio, hoping to reach Canada and become a trapper there before bootleggers scared him into returning to North Carolina. It happened, by the way. He was frightened by them at Lima, Ohio. And once I was giving a reading at Ohio State at Lima, and I mentioned that, and somebody came up to me afterward and said, yeah, Lima was a hangout for Al Capone's gang at that time. And the professor who said that said, when I bought my house, the realtor said, don't dig up the yard. so he really was scared by real gangsters. But throughout the Depression, he had done without a car. And after they were married, he seemed to have no interest in acquiring another vehicle. It was not that Daddy was lazy. He worked hard every day, harder than anyone I knew. When there was nothing else to do, Daddy took his scythe and mowed the road bank, the edges of the fields, the cemetery acre. He'd go out at daylight to mow. He liked to work in the rain. Daddy loved more than anything to work outside in wet weather. Beginning at daylight, he'd get out in the dripping brush to mow or pull weeds for the hog and chickens. The fact was that Daddy was a dreamer. Little of his work led to any profit or wages. It was almost as though he didn't want to make money. He wanted to be left alone with his thoughts, his reading. While Mama worried about getting to town to buy groceries, to get medicine at the drugstore, he was off somewhere mending a barbed wire fence or trimming brush at the edge of the pasture. He didn't concern himself with paying bills or getting children to the doctor. Yet he saw himself as ambitious, responsible, even thrifty. He criticized others for having no ambition. It was only when I was older that I realized there was little connection between Daddy's thoughts and his actions. In ragged overalls without a penny in his pockets, he'd stop working in the fields, lean on his hoe, and talk with anyone who would listen about George Washington or Napoleon. In his mind, he was far away in their world, untroubled by Mama's desperate worries about paying bills or getting to the doctor. Isn't he the perfect role model for a poet? I think he would have been a writer. Strangest of all was that Daddy didn't seem to care about his own problems with transportation. As a farmer, he needed his fields plowed, but made no effort to acquire a tractor. He needed a truck to haul seed and fertilizer from town and carry his bean poles to market, his pole beans to market. He needed a truck to haul wood and bean poles. But for all these things, he had to depend on his brother, or brother-in-law, or a neighbor who did have a pickup truck. One of the problems of relying on others for transportation to the produce market was that he could pick his beans only on days when others were going to market too, whether his beans were quite ready or over-ready. And since the relative first loaded his own beans on the truck, that meant there might not be room for Daddy's or for all of his. Sometimes he would pick beans and wire the hamper lids shut and set the baskets beside the road, and there would be no room for them on the truck. The beans sat there until the next day and wilted and brought a lower price when they finally did reach the market. Probably the most spectacular machine I saw when I was little was the crop duster. It came in summer to spray the bean fields along the river. In those days, no one worried about DDT or parathion as cancer-causing chemicals. Aerial crop dusting was common all over the country. Most of it in Henderson County was done by the two Oscars, Oscar Mayer and Oscar Case, who had biplanes. It would be hard to think of a more thrilling show for a boy of 4 or 5. The first time I saw the silver crop duster appear over the rim of the mountains and swoop down into the valley, I thought it must be going to crash. Down, down, down it came and disappeared behind the trees along the branch. And then through a gap in the pines, I saw it shoot by, skimming just over the bean rows of the bottom land. And then I saw what appeared to be gray-green smoke boiling out behind as the plane rose into view over the trees. I ran to the edge of the pasture where I could see better, and again the crop duster dove into the depths of the valley, dragging its trail of fog over the bean rows, then rising sharply to turn and come back. There was something glorious about its ability to turn by leaning. I didn't know the term chandelle then, but I grasped the meaning of the maneuver without having a name for it. Finally, the plane rose out of the bottomland, and instead of banking and turning, it kept climbing. Higher and higher it went, getting smaller. I ran farther out into the open to keep it in view, but it disappeared over the top of Mount Olivet, though I could hear the drone of the engine a little longer. And then the valley was quiet again. One of the special pleasures of my childhood was knowing my grandma Levi. She looked after me on weekdays while Mama worked in the cotton mill. When it was still dark in the wintertime, I walked with Mama across the frosty pasture every weekday morning to Grandma's house. As soon as it was daylight, I accompanied Grandma to the barn and watched as she bent over beside the cow and drew foaming, steaming milk into the pail. I can remember the teeth-chattering cold of those mornings, the spikes of frost, the smell of warm milk, cow breath, fresh manure. When the milking was done, Grandma led me back to the house, where she gave me a hot biscuit with June apple jelly. In those days, both my grandparents treated me like the center of their world. At lunchtime, which they called dinner time, they sat at either end of the table, me in the middle as they told stories and jokes and made me laugh. They ate soup, beans, and cornbread, and often had peaches, cake for dessert. Sometimes Grandma would make cookies, but the thing she made that I liked best were tater cakes, fried like sausages from mashed potatoes. On a cold day, hot tater cakes and cold milk are the perfect combination. I love to hear the story of how Grandpa had been born in a little house on top of Cicero Mountain. So premature, he weighed only 2 pounds and 12 ounces. In those days, premature babies usually died. He was so tiny they could only pin diapers around him and place him in a shoebox to stay warm. No one expected him to live. But he did live and grew up pale and puny. He was the most sickly of the children of Fate and Francis Levi. When he was 5, his mama took him to a doctor in Greenville, South Carolina, to see what could be done for his health. Surprisingly, the doctor recommended he start chewing tobacco. Having tried everything else, from faith healers to peddler's tonics, Francis gave him tobacco. Grandpa liked to tell how once he started chewing, he began to thrive. Not only was he healthy, but he grew taller and stronger than any of his brothers. He grew over 6 feet tall, and he had never seen a doctor since he was 5. And he never had a rotten tooth. He would get up and testify in church about his great health, and he ascribed it to the Lord and to tobacco. Grandma died of a brain tumor in 1948. People came to the house bringing bowls and platters and dishes. The house was full of neighbors talking in low voices. There were so many people, it was almost like a party. At the funeral, the preacher said Grandma had gone to a better place, that she was in heaven. And he read from the Bible about a house with many mansions in heaven. In the bright sunlight on the cemetery hill, I was almost blinded by the flowers heaped around and over the grave. I'd never seen so many flowers. The profusion of flowers, the crowd, the voice of the preacher made me dizzy. I watched the casket sink into the ground and then be covered up. My clearest memory is of when I said to Mama when we got back to the house, "The preacher told a lie," I said. "How did he tell a lie?" "He said Grandma had gone to heaven, but I saw them put her in the ground." Mama tried to explain that the real Grandma, her soul had gone to heaven. It was only the earthly body, no more important than a fingernail clipping, that had gone into the ground. But even so, I was puzzled by this apparent contradiction. I remember also the funeral for my Uncle Robert, who had been killed in a B-17 crash in England in 1943. His body was brought back in late 1948. So, I remember the honor guard who stood in their bright uniforms beside the steps of the church as the family went in. It was a hot day in late summer, and I dropped off to sleep during the service. But I remember sitting drowsy in the late afternoon heat under the tent beside the grave. I was startled by the command of the honor guard to present their rifles. The sergeant barked the orders in a tone of voice I'd never heard before. The soldiers raised their rifles all together and held them straight up in front of their faces, and the next order told them to work the bolts and put the rifles to their shoulders, aiming somewhere into the sky. They fired all at once, and I was so shocked I began to cry. "They're shooting at us," I said to Mama. "Shh," she answered. The soldiers fired again and again and then dropped their rifles back to the ground. Later, I was not sure why the shots scared me so. Maybe it was the surprise of the loud noise, but for months after that, I would live in fear of loud noises, afraid of guns, thunder, firecrackers, even the backfire of trucks. I feared a loud noise might crush my head, tear between my ears. No amount of reassurance from others could ease my fear. I dreaded any boom or bang and stayed away from anybody with a gun. Thunderstorms terrified me. And then suddenly, about a year after the funeral, Grandpa and a buddy began target practice with their .22 rifles out by the barn. And I was astonished to discover that the shots didn't hurt me at all. My terrific fear of loud noises began to vanish. Also in 1948, my mother began to plan a new house. She didn't want to live in the house down by the river anymore, and she drew a floor plan of the proposed house with a pencil and a ruler. It was her ideal house. It would have an electric stove and a bathroom. There would be 3 bedrooms. Day after day, she labored over the drawing, measuring and erasing. Daddy decided that if he had to build a house, he would cover it with rocks he got out of the river. He'd always admired rock houses. In fact, he claimed he hoped someday to build a castle. And those of you who remember him probably remember he talked about building a castle. He's going to build it out on the side of the mountain. Everything Mama could save from selling eggs and butter, calves and chickens, working in the cotton mill, she deposited in a savings account in the post office in Hendersonville. She didn't trust banks after their collapse during the Depression. In those days, the post office in town could be used like a bank. For 2 years, she saved every penny and placed it in the account. By the late summer of 1949, she had saved $1,700. That summer, Daddy made a few $100s from his pole bean farming. He had agreed to deposit the profits in the post office account. With over $2,000 saved, they could begin the work of building a new house on the mountainside. But in late summer, after Daddy sold his last beans, he came home carrying a rifle case. "What is that?" Mama said. Almost under his breath, Daddy admitted he had bought a new rifle for deer hunting. It was a Winchester Model 70 30-06. He had wanted for years and years and had never been able to afford. "You didn't put the money in the post office?" Mama said. Daddy shook his head. Mama turned white with fury. She broke into tears of disappointment. She accused Daddy of lying to her, of acting like a foolish boy. He'd wasted his money on the expensive rifle just when she was saving every cent to start the new house. He didn't have a car, or a truck, or tractor. He didn't even have his own horse. Had to borrow Grandpa's old nail. He didn't have a job or checking account, and yet he spent the profits of his summer on a ridiculous rifle. Much later, I would understand that Daddy had longed for that rifle all his life. He could no more resist buying it once he had the money than a drug addict could stop himself from buying heroin. To have not bought the rifle would have been like a kid refusing a candy bar or a new baseball. For the first time in his life, Daddy had the means and the rifle was available. I think it's Walker Hardware, some of you remember that. Now that the war was over, before that he had to borrow a rifle to hunt in Pisgah National Forest in deer season. What he had done was inevitable. The house place was bulldozed right at the end of the farming season in 1949. The last picking of beans was done when the vines were turning yellow and the leaves were speckled with nailhead rust. The spores of the rust covered your hands and arms like snuff or cinnamon as you picked. By then, briars had grown up in the rows, but beans picked at the end of the season brought the best prices because they were few and the crops in South Florida were not quite ready yet. It was well worth gleaning the last few baskets from the dying fields. When we picked the last beans and loaded them into my uncle's truck, Daddy went along to market. Evangeline and I, my sister Evangeline, and I were excited because we knew that when Daddy went to the bean market, he often returned with a watermelon. We waited anxiously for him to come home, and just before supper, my uncle's truck stopped in front of the house. Daddy got out and sure enough set a watermelon on the bank of the road. But then he lifted something else out of the truck and set it at the edge of the yard. It was a new wheelbarrow with a fat, inflated tire. It's hard to explain why Evangeline and I were so excited about the wheelbarrow. Maybe it was the surprise or the combination of watermelon and the gleaming contractor's wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow sat in the yard while we ate watermelon after supper, and I could not take my eyes off it. The implement was polished, had polished oak arms and a deep green bucket. The tire was smaller than a truck tire, but inflated and cushiony, smelled like new rubber. As soon as the watermelon was eaten, Daddy said we would push the wheelbarrow up to the new house place. For some reason, that delighted Evangeline and me even more. As Daddy rolled the wheelbarrow along the trail at the edge of the orchard, we ran along and danced around it. Mama followed to the clearing the bulldozer had made just as twilight turned into dusk. The light in the trees in the clearing was mellow and fuzzy as Daddy showed Mama where he would lay the foundation of the house and pour the footing. Evangeline and I took turns climbing into the wheelbarrow and trying to give each other rides. Twice we turned it over and spilled it on the ground and ended up laughing. In the gloaming, we ran around the wheelbarrow like we were drunk, and it was a pagan idol that inspired worship. We rolled it backward and forward to the edge of the raw earth yard. We didn't have a car or truck, but we had a new house place and a brand new wheelbarrow. Look at them, Daddy said and laughed. You would think I had bought a new truck. So happened that I got that Christmas what was probably the most important Christmas present I was ever to receive. I knew it was from Mama, who thought of it, and Mama, who had bought it. She had always told me there was no such person as Santa Claus. Under the Christmas tree that morning sat a gray metal box with a handle on top of it, a toolbox, and inside the box there was a little saw, hammer, bracing bit, file, hatchet, rasp, screwdriver, level, tri-squire, hacksaw, tape measure, carpenter's pencil, chisel, and pliers. In the next 2 or 3 years, I would ruin heaps of scrap lumber with that tool set. I sawed and hammered biplanes, triplanes, fighter planes, heavy bombers, even tried to make a well digger with a tower and wheel at the top, a spool that held the thread tied to a drill bit. Sometimes I got so angry when I mashed a finger or made a mistake that I threw the hammer, saw, or chisel into the woods. And then when I cooled off, had to go in search of the tool in the leaves, feeling foolish and chastened. One of the machines that fascinated me most in those days was Grandpa's radio. It sat in the living room of the Levi house opposite the fireplace. The radio cabinet was tall as I was, with Gothic windows stretched with cloth over the speakers. The tuning window lit up when the radio was turned on. Grandpa rolled the knob with the heel of his hand to make the needle advance or go back past numbers to find stations. Whines, whistles, shrieks, crackles came out of it. It was a mystery.